In the mist-shrouded valleys of the Carpathian mountains, where ancient forests whisper secrets older than memory, there exists a terror that predates the Gothic romance of Count Dracula by centuries. This is not the story of a charming aristocrat with a cape and fangs. This is something far more primal, far more intimate, and infinitely more terrifying. Deep in the heart of Romania, in villages where time seems to stand still, the old people still speak in hushed tones of the Moroi. They cross themselves when they say the name, and they never speak of it after dark. For the Moroi is not merely a creature of folklore. It is a curse that lives in the blood itself, a spiritual corruption that can transform the most beloved family member into an unholy predator. Tonight we journey into the shadowed world of Romania's most feared supernatural entity. We will uncover the ancient beliefs that gave birth to this terror, explore the desperate rituals used to contain it, and discover how this forgotten nightmare shaped an entire culture's understanding of death, blood, and the thin veil between the living and the damned. This is the true story of the vampire before vampires had a name. This is the blood curse of the Moroi. The story begins not in the grand castles of Transylvania, but in the humble villages scattered throughout the Romanian countryside. These were communities where life and death walked hand in hand, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was as fragile as morning mist. Here, in these forgotten corners of the world, the Moroi was born from humanity's deepest fears about what happens when death refuses to be final. Unlike the sophisticated vampire of modern fiction, the Moroi emerged from a worldview that saw death not as an ending but as a transformation. In the ancient Romanian understanding, the soul did not simply depart the body upon death. Instead, it lingered, tethered to the physical world by unfinished business, unresolved emotions, or most terrifyingly, by an insatiable spiritual hunger that death could not satisfy. The word Moroi itself carries weight in the Romanian language. It derives from the word mort, meaning death, but it signifies something far more complex than simple mortality. A Moroi is a dead person who refuses to remain dead, whose spirit has become corrupted by an otherworldly thirst that transforms them into something monstrous. But what separates the Moroi from other undead creatures is its intimate connection to the family unit. This was not a stranger lurking in distant castles. The Moroi was your father, your mother, your child, your spouse. It was the person you had loved most in life, returned as your greatest nightmare. The transformation into a Moroi was believed to begin during life itself. Certain individuals were marked from birth, carrying within them a spiritual weakness that made them vulnerable to this dark fate. Those born with unusual physical characteristics during certain phases of the moon or under specific astrological conditions were watched with a mixture of love and dread by their families. The community knew that when death came for these marked souls, it might not be the end of their story. The signs of potential Moroi transformation were numerous and deeply embedded in Romanian folk wisdom. A child born with a caul, that thin membrane sometimes covering a newborn's face, was considered especially susceptible. This natural occurrence was interpreted as a sign that the child existed partially in both worlds, making them vulnerable to the pull of the undead realm. Similarly, those born as the seventh child in a family or during the dark phase of the moon carried this spiritual burden. But perhaps most feared were those who died with unfinished business, consumed by powerful emotions like rage, jealousy, or overwhelming love. These intense feelings were believed to anchor the soul to the earthly plane, preventing it from finding peace in death. The Moroi's hunger was unlike anything in the natural world. While living vampires of folklore might drain blood or life force, the Moroi consumed something far more essential. It fed on the spiritual energy of its victims, particularly targeting family members and loved ones. This feeding was not a violent attack, but a slow, insidious drain that could continue for months or even years. Victims of a Moroi would experience a gradual decline that perfectly mimicked what we now understand as wasting diseases. They would grow pale and weak, lose their appetite, and suffer from persistent nightmares. Most disturbingly, they would report visitations from their deceased relative, who would appear in dreams or at the edge of their vision, always watching, always hungry. The Moroi's appearance was a grotesque parody of its former self. Unlike the elegant vampires of literature, these creatures bore the unmistakable marks of death and corruption. Their skin would be pale and mottled, their eyes sunken and glowing with an unnatural light. Most horrifying of all, they retained enough of their human appearance to be recognizable, making encounters with them deeply traumatic for surviving family members. These beings were said to possess supernatural strength and the ability to phase in and out of the physical world at will. They could enter homes through the smallest cracks, pass through walls, and appear suddenly in locked rooms. Their presence was often announced by a drop in temperature, the smell of decay, or the inexplicable feeling of being watched. But the Moroi's most terrifying ability was its intimate knowledge of its victims. Having once been family, it knew every weakness, every fear, every secret. It could manipulate emotions with devastating precision, using love and guilt as weapons to draw its victims closer. Many accounts tell of family members who willingly allowed themselves to be drained because they could not bear to harm what had once been their beloved relative. The feeding process itself was described in horrifying detail by those few who survived encounters with the Moroi. Unlike the quick bite of fictional vampires, the Moroi's drain was slow and methodical. It would place its cold hands upon its victim and slowly draw out their life essence, leaving them feeling hollow and drained. This process could be repeated night after night, gradually weakening the victim until they too died and potentially joined the ranks of the undead. What made the Moroi particularly insidious was its selective nature. It did not attack randomly but focused its attention on specific family members, often those who had been closest to it in life. A Moroi might completely ignore some relatives while relentlessly pursuing others, creating divisions and suspicions within families that could last for generations. The creature's intelligence was another source of terror. Unlike mindless undead monsters, the Moroi retained much of its human cunning and memory. It could plan, scheme, and manipulate situations to its advantage. Some accounts describe Moroi that would appear during family gatherings, mimicking their old behavior so perfectly that their true nature would only be revealed by subtle signs, a lack of reflection in mirrors, an inability to cross running water, or the way animals would flee in terror from their presence. This intelligence also meant that the Moroi could hold grudges from beyond the grave. Those who had wronged it in life would find themselves particular targets of its supernatural wrath. It might torment them with nightmares, cause their crops to fail, or slowly drain the life from their children. The Moroi's revenge was patient and thorough, sometimes spanning decades as it methodically destroyed everything its target held dear. The relationship between the Moroi and its living relatives created impossible moral dilemmas. How could a family defend itself against a creature that had once been their cherished loved one? The traditional weapons against evil, crosses, holy water, prayers, often proved ineffective against a Moroi. Perhaps because the bonds of family love created a spiritual connection that transcended religious protection. This powerlessness in the face of the Moroi's hunger led to the development of elaborate prevention rituals, complex burial practices designed to ensure that the dead would remain dead. These practices reveal the depth of fear that the Moroi inspired and the lengths to which Romanian communities would go to protect themselves from this intimate terror. The prevention of Moroi transformation began long before death. Families with members suspected of carrying the curse would take extraordinary precautions throughout the person's life. They might consult with priests, wise women, or traveling mystics who claimed to know rituals that could break the spiritual weakness before it manifested in death. When death finally came to a suspected Moroi, the funeral preparations became a race against time. The body had to be properly prepared and buried before the soul could fully separate and potentially return as something monstrous. These preparations were far more complex than ordinary funeral rites, involving specific positioning of the corpse, the placement of protective objects, and the performance of binding rituals designed to anchor the soul to its proper place in the afterlife. The fear of the Moroi was so pervasive that it influenced every aspect of Romanian death customs. Even for those not specifically suspected of carrying the curse, precautionary measures were often taken. Bodies were buried with their hands bound, their mouths filled with garlic or sacred objects, and their graves protected by iron spikes or blessed stones. These practices reveal a culture living in constant awareness of death's potential for horror. The Moroi represented the ultimate violation of the natural order, the transformation of love into terror, of family bonds into supernatural predation. It was a fear that went beyond mere superstition, touching on fundamental anxieties about mortality, family relationships, and the possibility that death might not provide the peace and closure that the living desperately needed. As we delve deeper into this ancient terror, we begin to understand that the Moroi was more than just a monster story. It was a complex cultural response to the mysteries of death and the human need to explain the inexplicable. In the isolated villages of Romania, where medical knowledge was limited and sudden deaths were common, the Moroi provided a framework for understanding tragedy and loss. The legend served multiple functions within the community. It offered an explanation for wasting diseases, family curses, and the lingering sense of presence that bereaved relatives often experienced. It provided a way to process grief and guilt, transforming these powerful emotions into something that could be fought and potentially overcome. But perhaps most importantly, the Moroi legend reinforced the sacred nature of family bonds, while simultaneously acknowledging their potential for destruction. It recognized that love itself could become corrupted, that the strongest human connections could be transformed into sources of supernatural terror. This understanding of the Moroi as both monster and metaphor helps explain its enduring power in Romanian culture. Unlike external threats that could be fought or fled from, the Moroi represented an internal corruption, a rot at the heart of the family structure that could only be combated through vigilance, ritual, and community solidarity. The next phase of our journey will take us deeper into the specific beliefs and practices surrounding the Moroi, exploring how entire communities organize themselves around the prevention and combating of this intimate terror. We will examine the role of the village wise women and priests who claim to understand the creature's nature, and we will uncover the desperate measures taken by families who believed they were under attack by their own beloved dead. The terror of the Moroi did not exist in isolation. Across the Romanian countryside, entire communities developed elaborate defense systems against this intimate horror. These were not the hasty precautions of panicked villagers, but sophisticated networks of knowledge and practice that had been refined over centuries of confronting the undead. At the heart of every village's defense against the Moroi stood the figure of the Moașa, the wise woman who served as both midwife and guardian against supernatural threats. These women possessed knowledge that was both practical and mystical, understanding the signs that marked a potential Moroi from the moment of birth. They were present at every delivery, watching for the telltale omens that would determine a child's spiritual fate. The Moașa's role extended far beyond childbirth. She was the keeper of the community's collective memory about the Moroi, maintaining detailed mental records of every family's supernatural history. She knew which bloodlines carried the curse, which children had been born under inauspicious signs, and most importantly, she understood the complex rituals required to prevent the transformation from living person to undead predator. When death approached someone suspected of carrying the Moroi curse, the Moașa would be summoned immediately. Her presence at the deathbed was considered essential, for she alone possessed the knowledge to perform the binding rituals that could prevent the soul from returning as something monstrous. These death vigils were intense affairs, with the wise woman maintaining constant watch over the dying person, ready to intervene at the precise moment of death. The rituals themselves were intricate and varied depending on the specific nature of the suspected curse. For those born with a call, the Moașa would perform a ceremony involving the careful burning of that preserved membrane, believing that destroying this physical link to the other world would sever the soul's ability to return. The ashes would then be mixed with holy water and sprinkled over the corpse, creating a spiritual barrier that the Moroi could not cross. For the seventh child, different precautions were required. The Moașa would place specific objects in the coffin, items that were believed to confuse or distract the potential Moroi. A handful of poppy seeds might be scattered over the body based on the belief that an undead creature would be compelled to count each seed, keeping it occupied until sunrise, when it would be forced to return to its grave. Iron nails would be driven into the coffin lid, and sometimes through the heart itself, physically pinning the corpse to prevent its resurrection. But the most feared cases were those who died with powerful emotions still burning in their hearts. These souls required the most extreme measures, for their spiritual corruption was believed to be the deepest. The Moașa would perform elaborate purification rituals, washing the body with water that had been blessed by multiple priests and infused with protective herbs. Sometimes the corpse would be turned face down in the coffin, ensuring that if it did attempt to claw its way out, it would only dig deeper into the earth. The positioning of the body was crucial in all cases. The hands had to be bound with blessed cord, preventing the Moroi from using them to emerge from the grave. The mouth would be stuffed with garlic, salt, or sacred wafers, creating barriers that the creature could not overcome. In extreme cases, a silver coin would be placed on each eye, and a cross carved from hawthorn wood would be pressed into the corpse's hands. These burial preparations were not performed in secret, but were witnessed by the entire community. The villagers understood that their collective safety depended on the proper execution of these rituals. They would gather around the grave as the Moașa performed her work, adding their own prayers and protective gestures to the ceremony. This communal participation served both practical and psychological purposes, ensuring that the rituals were performed correctly, while also reinforcing the community's shared commitment to defending against the supernatural threat. The graves themselves became fortress-like structures designed to contain the potential Moroi. They were often surrounded by barriers of iron spikes, blessed stones, or thorny branches from wild roses. Some communities would plant hawthorn trees around suspected Moroi graves, believing that these sacred plants would create an impenetrable spiritual barrier. The graves would be visited regularly by the Moașa and other village elders, who would check for signs of disturbance and renew the protective wards as needed. But despite all these precautions, sometimes the unthinkable would happen. A Moroi would still rise, slipping past even the most carefully constructed defenses to begin its terrible work. When this occurred, the community faced its greatest nightmare: the transformation of prevention into active combat against a creature that had once been their neighbor, their relative, their friend. The first signs of a successful Moroi resurrection were subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to watch for. Family members of the deceased would begin to experience the characteristic symptoms: the gradual wasting, the persistent nightmares, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Livestock would sicken and die without apparent cause. Crops would wither in the fields despite favorable weather. A pall of spiritual corruption would settle over the affected area like a malignant fog. When these signs appeared, the Moașa would be called upon once again, this time not as a preventative measure, but as a warrior in a battle for the souls of the living. She would begin by conducting a thorough investigation, interviewing the affected family members to determine the exact nature of the supernatural attack. She would examine the grave site for signs of disturbance, looking for the small holes that a Moroi was believed to use to enter and exit its resting place. The wise woman's diagnostic methods were both practical and mystical. She would observe the patterns of the attacks, noting which family members were being targeted and when the visitations occurred. She would study the dreams and visions reported by the victims, searching for clues about the Moroi's motivations and weaknesses. Most importantly, she would attempt to communicate with the creature itself, using ancient rituals of summoning and binding to force it to reveal its true nature. These confrontations were extraordinarily dangerous, for they required the Moașa to make herself vulnerable to the very entity she was trying to combat. She would enter into trance states that allowed her to perceive the Moroi directly, engaging in battles of will that could last for hours or even days. The outcome of these spiritual duels often determined whether the community would be freed from the creature's influence, or would fall deeper under its malevolent power. If the Moașa's initial attempts at binding the Moroi failed, more drastic measures would be required. The entire community would mobilize for what amounted to a supernatural siege, implementing protective measures that could affect every aspect of daily life. Houses would be blessed and warded with protective symbols. Families would be required to follow strict protocols about when they could leave their homes and what precautions they must take. Children would be kept under constant supervision, never allowed to venture out alone after dark. The siege mentality that gripped a community under Moroi attack created an atmosphere of constant tension and fear. Neighbors would watch each other for signs of supernatural influence, looking for the telltale symptoms that indicated someone had become a victim of the creature's feeding. Trust would begin to break down as people wondered whether their loved ones might be hiding their encounters with the undead predator. This social breakdown was perhaps the Moroi's most insidious weapon. By targeting family relationships and exploiting the bonds of love and loyalty, the creature could tear apart the very fabric of community life. Families would turn against each other, convinced that their relatives were either victims or willing collaborators with the supernatural threat. The paranoia and suspicion that accompanied a Moroi attack could persist long after the creature itself had been dealt with, leaving lasting scars on the community's social structure. In the most extreme cases, when all other measures had failed and the Moroi's influence continued to spread, the community would be forced to take the ultimate step. The creature's grave would be opened, and its corpse would be subjected to the final destruction ritual. This was not undertaken lightly, for it required the violation of sacred burial grounds and the desecration of what had once been a human being. The exhumation would be performed by the Moașa, and a select group of village elders working under the cover of darkness to avoid attracting the attention of the creature they were trying to destroy. When the coffin was opened, they expected to find evidence of the Moroi's supernatural nature. The corpse might appear unnaturally preserved, with fresh blood on its lips and hands. Its hair and nails might have continued growing after death. Most horrifying of all, the body might show signs of movement within the coffin, with the burial shroud torn and displaced by the creature's struggles to escape. The destruction ritual that followed was both brutal and sacred. The corpse would be pierced through the heart with a stake made from hawthorn or ash wood, physically pinning it to prevent any further resurrection. The head would often be severed and buried separately from the body, ensuring that even if the creature attempted to rise again, it would be unable to function. In the most extreme cases, the entire corpse would be burned, with the ashes scattered in running water to prevent any possibility of reassembly. These destruction rituals were the community's last resort, employed only when all other methods had failed and the Moroi's threat had become too great to contain. They represented the ultimate victory of the living over the dead, but they came at a terrible cost. The families of the destroyed Moroi would be left to grapple with the knowledge that their loved one had become a monster and that they had been forced to participate in its final annihilation. The psychological impact of these experiences shaped Romanian culture in profound ways. The constant awareness of the Moroi threat influenced everything from architecture to agriculture. From family planning to funeral customs, houses were built with specific features designed to keep out supernatural intruders. Farming practices incorporated rituals meant to protect crops from undead influence. Even marriage customs were affected, with families carefully investigating the supernatural history of potential spouses before allowing unions to proceed. This pervasive fear of the intimate undead created a culture of hypervigilance around death and dying. Every funeral became a potential battleground, every grave a possible source of future terror. The living were forced to maintain constant awareness of the spiritual state of their deceased relatives, watching for signs that love had been corrupted into something monstrous. The knowledge required to combat the Moroi was carefully guarded and passed down through specific lineages. The Moașa would train selected apprentices in the complex rituals and diagnostic techniques required to identify and combat the creatures. This knowledge was considered both precious and dangerous, for those who possessed it became targets for the very entities they sought to destroy. As we prepare to explore the documented cases of Moroi encounters and their lasting impact on Romanian society, we begin to understand how this ancient terror shaped an entire culture's relationship with death, family, and the supernatural. The Moroi was not merely a monster to be feared, but a complex spiritual phenomenon that demanded sophisticated responses from the communities it threatened. The transmission of Moroi knowledge created a shadowy network of wisdom keepers across the Romanian countryside. These guardians of supernatural lore operated in the spaces between official religion and ancient paganism, preserving secrets that the church often preferred to ignore or suppress. Their expertise was both revered and feared, for to understand the Moroi was to walk dangerously close to its realm. The apprenticeship of a future Moașa began in childhood, often with girls who had shown unusual sensitivity to supernatural phenomena. These children might have experienced prophetic dreams, demonstrated an ability to sense spiritual presences, or been born under astrological conditions that marked them as naturally gifted in otherworldly matters. Their training was rigorous and secretive, conducted in the deep hours of the night when the veil between worlds was thinnest. The knowledge passed down through these lineages was vast and intricate. Apprentices learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished a potential Moroi from an ordinary death. They memorized hundreds of protective incantations, each tailored to specific circumstances and types of supernatural threat. They studied the complex relationships between lunar cycles, seasonal changes, and spiritual activity, understanding how these natural rhythms affected the behavior of the undead. Most importantly, they learned to recognize the psychological patterns that made individuals vulnerable to Moroi attack. The wise women understood that the creature's power came not just from supernatural abilities, but from its intimate knowledge of human weakness. A skilled Moașa could identify the emotional wounds and unresolved conflicts that made a person susceptible to spiritual predation, allowing her to provide protective counseling alongside her ritual interventions. The diagnostic techniques employed by these practitioners were sophisticated psychological tools disguised as folk magic. They would conduct lengthy interviews with affected families, probing not just for supernatural symptoms but for the underlying emotional dynamics that might have attracted a Moroi's attention. They understood that guilt, unresolved grief, and family secrets created spiritual vulnerabilities that the undead could exploit. These investigations often revealed disturbing truths about family relationships. The Moașa might discover that the deceased had harbored deep resentments or unfulfilled desires that could fuel their transformation into a predatory spirit. She might uncover evidence of abuse, betrayal, or abandonment that had left the dying person in a state of spiritual turmoil. These revelations were handled with extreme discretion, for the wise women understood that family secrets were often more dangerous than supernatural threats. The treatment protocols developed by the Moașa went far beyond simple exorcism or spiritual cleansing. They recognized that combating a Moroi required healing the living as much as banishing the dead. Affected family members would undergo elaborate purification rituals designed to strengthen their spiritual defenses and break the emotional bonds that the creature was exploiting. These healing ceremonies could last for days or even weeks, involving the entire extended family in a process of collective spiritual renewal. The participants would engage in ritual confessions, admitting to grudges and resentments that might be providing the Moroi with entry points into their lives. They would perform acts of symbolic forgiveness, releasing the deceased from earthly obligations and freeing themselves from the guilt that bound them to the supernatural predator. The physical components of these healing rituals were equally elaborate. The affected household would be completely purified, with every object blessed and every surface cleansed with holy water and protective herbs. The family's clothing would be burned and replaced, symbolically shedding the spiritual contamination that had made them vulnerable to attack. Even their food would be specially prepared according to ancient recipes designed to strengthen the soul against supernatural influence. These comprehensive interventions often succeeded where simpler approaches had failed. By addressing both the spiritual and psychological dimensions of the Moroi threat, the wise women could break the cycle of predation that trapped families in supernatural terror. The creature, deprived of the emotional energy that sustained it, would often retreat to its grave and remain dormant, though vigilant monitoring would continue for years to ensure it did not return. However, not every case could be resolved through healing and purification. Some Moroi were too powerful, too deeply rooted in earthly concerns, or too sustained by the spiritual wounds they fed upon to be easily banished. These creatures required more direct confrontation, forcing the Moașa to engage in supernatural combat that tested the limits of her knowledge and courage. The battle techniques employed against resistant Moroi were among the most closely guarded secrets of the wise women's tradition. These methods involved entering altered states of consciousness that allowed direct communication with the supernatural realm. The practitioner would use combinations of meditation, herbal preparations, and ritual implements to project her spirit into the other world where the Moroi dwelt between its visits to the living realm. These spiritual journeys were extraordinarily dangerous. The Moașa's consciousness, separated from her physical body, became vulnerable to attack from the very creature she was trying to combat. The Moroi, in its native spiritual realm, possessed advantages that it lacked in the physical world. It could manifest its true power, appearing not as the decaying corpse that rose from the grave, but as a being of pure, malevolent energy capable of destroying an unprepared soul. The confrontations that took place in this other world were battles of will and spiritual strength, rather than physical combat. The wise woman would attempt to bind the Moroi using ancient words of power, forcing it to reveal the source of its earthly attachment and the means by which it could be permanently banished. The creature would resist these attempts, launching psychic attacks designed to break the practitioner's concentration and leave her soul trapped in the spiritual realm. These battles could rage for hours in the other world, while lasting only minutes in physical reality. Observers would see the Moașa lying motionless in deep trance, her body occasionally convulsing as her spirit fought for survival in dimensions beyond normal perception. The outcome of these confrontations often determined not just the fate of the affected family, but the life or death of the wise woman herself. Many practitioners were lost to these spiritual battles, their souls consumed or trapped by the Moroi they had attempted to banish. Their bodies would remain alive but empty, existing in a catatonic state that the community recognized as a form of living death. These tragic outcomes served as stark reminders of the terrible price that could be paid for confronting the supernatural realm directly. The successful banishment of a powerful Moroi required not just individual courage, but community support on an unprecedented scale. The entire village would participate in elaborate ritual procedures designed to strengthen the Moașa's spiritual defenses and provide her with the collective will needed to overcome the creature's resistance. These community rituals created temporary sacred spaces where the normal rules of reality were suspended and direct intervention in supernatural affairs became possible. The most extreme of these procedures involved the creation of what the wise women called a soul trap, a spiritual construct designed to capture and contain the Moroi's essence permanently. This required the voluntary participation of multiple family members who were willing to offer portions of their own life force to power the binding spell. The risks were enormous, for failure could result in the entire family being consumed by the creature they were trying to destroy. The construction of a soul trap began with the preparation of a physical focus. usually an object that had belonged to the deceased before their transformation. This item would be subjected to elaborate purification rituals, then inscribed with protective symbols using ink made from blessed materials and the blood of willing participants. The object would then be placed at the center of a complex ritual circle, surrounded by offerings and protective barriers. The binding ceremony itself required precise timing, usually performed during the dark of the moon when spiritual energies were at their most malleable. The participating family members would join hands around the ritual circle, creating a human barrier that the Moroi could not cross. The Moașa would enter her trance state and venture into the other world to confront the creature, while the circle maintained the spiritual anchors that would allow her to return safely. The moment of binding was often marked by dramatic supernatural phenomena. Witnesses reported sudden temperature drops, unexplained winds, and the appearance of ghostly lights that danced around the ritual circle. The physical focus object would sometimes levitate or emit strange sounds as the Moroi's essence was drawn into it. In successful bindings, the object would suddenly become unbearably cold to the touch, indicating that the creature's spirit had been successfully trapped within. Once bound, the soul trap would be treated with extreme caution. It could never be destroyed, for doing so would release the Moroi back into the world with renewed power and fury. Instead, it would be hidden in a secret location known only to the Moașa and her most trusted apprentices. These hidden repositories of supernatural evil became part of the landscape of Romanian folklore. Mysterious places that were avoided by the wise and feared by all who knew their true nature. The psychological impact of these intense supernatural encounters extended far beyond the immediate participants. Word of successful Moroi banishments would spread throughout the region, carried by traveling merchants and visiting relatives who had witnessed the dramatic proceedings. These stories served multiple functions within the broader community, providing both reassurance that the supernatural threat could be overcome and stark warnings about the terrible price that such victories required. The accounts of these encounters began to take on legendary status, passed down through generations as cautionary tales and inspirational stories. They formed a body of oral literature that preserved not just the technical knowledge of supernatural combat, but the emotional and spiritual wisdom that had been gained through direct confrontation with the forces of darkness. These stories revealed patterns in Moroi behavior that helped future generations understand and prepare for similar threats. They documented the creature's weaknesses and the conditions that made successful banishment possible. Most importantly, they preserved the memory of the brave individuals who had sacrificed their safety, and sometimes their lives, to protect their communities from supernatural predation. The evolution of these tales over time reflected changing attitudes toward the supernatural within Romanian culture. Early accounts focused primarily on the technical aspects of the encounters, describing ritual procedures and supernatural phenomena in matter-of-fact terms. Later versions began to emphasize the heroic qualities of the participants, transforming practical accounts into epic narratives of good triumphing over evil. This transformation was not merely literary embellishment, but reflected a fundamental shift in how Romanian communities understood their relationship with the supernatural realm. As the immediate threat of Moroi attacks became less common, the stories began to serve different purposes, providing moral instruction and cultural identity rather than practical guidance for supernatural combat. The decline in active Moroi encounters during the late 19th and early 20th centuries coincided with broader changes in Romanian society. Urbanization, education, and the influence of modern medical knowledge began to erode the traditional worldview that had sustained belief in the intimate undead. Younger generations exposed to scientific explanations for the phenomena that their ancestors had attributed to supernatural causes began to view the old stories with skepticism. However, the cultural impact of the Moroi tradition proved more resilient than the literal beliefs that had created it. The psychological insights embedded in the folklore continued to resonate with people struggling to understand family dynamics, grief, and the complex emotions surrounding death. The rituals and practices developed to combat supernatural threats were adapted to address more mundane but equally challenging aspects of human experience. Modern Romanian psychology and psychiatry still bear traces of the wisdom traditions that emerged from centuries of confronting the Moroi. The understanding that emotional wounds can create vulnerability to predatory influences, that family secrets can become sources of spiritual contamination, and that healing requires community support rather than individual effort, all reflect insights that were first codified in the context of supernatural combat. The transformation of Moroi beliefs into psychological understanding represents one of the most sophisticated examples of folk wisdom evolving to meet changing cultural needs. The communities that had once mobilized to combat undead predators learned to apply the same principles to addressing domestic violence, mental illness, and social dysfunction. The Moașa's diagnostic techniques were adapted to identify and treat psychological trauma, while the community support systems developed for supernatural crises were modified to help families cope with more conventional but equally devastating challenges. This evolution demonstrates the fundamental truth that lay at the heart of the Moroi tradition. The real monsters were not supernatural entities rising from graves, but the human capacities for cruelty, manipulation, and emotional predation that could transform love into terror and family bonds into instruments of destruction. The folklore provided a framework for recognizing and combating these very real threats, regardless of whether they were attributed to supernatural or psychological causes. As we approach the final phase of our exploration into the world of the Moroi, we begin to see how this ancient terror laid the groundwork for Romania's later vampire legends, the sophisticated understanding of undead psychology, the detailed knowledge of supernatural combat techniques, and the complex social structures developed to address otherworldly threats would all contribute to the creation of more famous creatures like Dracula. But the Moroi's influence extends far beyond its role as a precursor to literary vampires. It represents a complete worldview, a way of understanding the relationship between life and death, love and terror, individual desire and community responsibility. This worldview shaped Romanian culture in ways that persist to the present day, influencing everything from family relationships to attitudes toward death and dying. The next and final phase of our journey will explore how the Moroi tradition contributed to the creation of the vampire mythology that would eventually captivate the entire world. We will trace the evolution from intimate family terror to gothic romance, examining how the raw psychological insights of Romanian folklore were transformed into the sophisticated literary constructs that define modern vampire fiction.